Okay, our next speaker today is Kate Jones. Kate is an analytical chemist working as principal scientist in Health and Safety Laboratories Biological Monitoring Team. She has wide experience and expertise in the biological monitoring of organic compounds, and this includes skills in the use of specialist analytical techniques and instrumentation such as GC, GCMS, HPLC and LCMS, methods development, toxicology and gaining approval for and running human volunteer studies. Kate is actively involved in disseminating her work through peer-reviewed publications, presentations at relevant scientific and stakeholder conferences, and at research workshops. She was the joint recipient of the 2014 BOHS Thomas Bedford Prize for a large intervention study on the control of isocyanates in the motor vehicle repair industry. Kate is currently the chair of the Royal Society of Chemistry's Toxicology Group and AIOH's Scientific Committee on Occupational Toxicology. She also serves on the council of the BOHS. So can we please welcome Kate to talk to us about biological monitoring that works.
As you can see, I spend so much time on committees that I don't actually do any real work anymore. So I apologise, I have a cold, but I'll try not to sniff or cough or too much. First of all, I'd just like to thank Simon and the committee for inviting me over here. I've never been to Australia before, so it's all new to me, and so far it's all fabulous. So thank you very much for the experience, and hopefully you'll feel that this is partially rewarding the great expense that I've cost. So, biological monitoring that works. I work for the Health and Safety Executive in the UK, which is obviously the government regulator. But I am in the laboratory, so most of our work is in support of the regulator through either incident investigations or research and development. But we also offer a lot of commercial testing and advice and research as well. So we have an interesting and very broad remit. And biological monitoring is a very tiny amount of what the Health and Safety Laboratory does. So we do everything from fire and explosions to human psychology to industrial hygiene and its related disciplines. So I was given this title. So I'll start off with what is biological monitoring, because occasionally I get people talking about microbiology, and I don't want to upset anybody or disappoint anybody. So biological monitoring is the assessment of overall systemic exposure to chemicals, the measurement of either that chemical itself or a metabolite or a breakdown product in a biological fluid. Traditionally, that was blood sampling. Most of our work now is based on urine sampling, being a non-invasive sample. And there are other various sampling media that can be used. Breath sampling has particular applications, and people are always looking at new and more interesting fluids that they can extract from people. So things like hair and nails have been proposed as longer-term markers of exposure. Saliva has been looked at repeatedly over the years as potential for various different exposures. But most of the practical biological monitoring that's done is based on urine sampling. So as I said, I was given the title Biological Monitoring That Works, and the first thing I thought of, well, what do they mean by works? That could mean anything. So I shall go through some various definitions of what work might mean, and I will come to the one that I think they meant in the end. So biological monitoring that works could mean that people use it and it is widely accepted as a tool. Obviously, this is a sort of virtuous circle. If you have more use of something, it will become cheaper, it will become more widely available, and that will then make more people use it, and it become more widely available. For that to happen, you do have to have simple systems, you know. So something like urine sampling by postal service is something that can be promulgated widely. If you have to have medics or phlebotomists taking blood samples, and you have to courier your samples at specific temperatures, and there are you know, the analysis takes 4 weeks to get done, then the chances of that being widely adopted in the real world is very limited. The more that gets done, what was seen to be best practice by leading companies in the industry then becomes standard practice across a wider range of companies. And we've seen that in the motor vehicle repair industry in the UK, and I will talk about our work in that briefly later. Obviously, if something becomes more used, and then there will be people who see that you can make money out of that. And, you know, I'm not here to diss any laboratories, but the analysis might be the same for a blood sample and an air sample or a soil sample. But actually, the analysis is only a small percentage of what you're doing the sampling for. What you want to know is, what does that number mean? And I'd like to say that we pride ourselves on knowing what the number means and providing you with the best advice that we can give about what that number means. If you already know what the number means, fine, go for the cheap option. But when you get a problem and they don't know how to help you, that's when you think, okay, that's not really working. So that's not biological monitoring that works. Just to look at the sort of tests that we do in our laboratory. By far the most single analyte that we do is isocyanates. So we have 10% of our samples are for lead, and that's because it's required by law in the UK, as in many countries around the world, of course. Isocyanates, as I said, counts for about a quarter of our overall analysis, and that's because it has been heavily promoted by HSE through this national intervention programme, and there's also a guidance value, and there's also a recommendation from HSE inspectors that they expect to see annual testing, although it's not required by law. They will ask you difficult questions about how you can prove that control is adequate without using a urine sample. So it's near as damn it, shall we say. For the other organics and inorganics, testing is mostly driven by whether there are guidance values. If there are UK guidance values, that will drive more testing than if there are other international guidance values. And whenever HSE does a research project, that will also drive interest and further testing by the industry. Another definition of what works might be the development of biological monitoring. So what worked yesterday might not be sufficient today. So increased use of biological monitoring brings increased rigor in the analysis. Quality assurance then becomes developed and available, and that's one of the big issues, is that for many of the new things that we measure, there is no quality assurance. There may not even be other labs doing the same analysis. So how do you know that the number you get is the right number? To some extent, if you stick with the same lab and they can prove that they have good reproducibility, it doesn't matter, because the actual number is just a figment. But as long as you're comparing previous results against these results, then you can work your way through that. But obviously, as things become more widespread, quality assurance becomes a very important method for demonstrating competence between laboratories and giving the customers, and I consider occupational hygienists to be the primary customers of biological monitoring rather than occupational medicine, gives the customer confidence that the result they're getting is a proper result and they can be relied upon. There are idiosyncrasies to biological analysis that don't apply to air analysis, for example. Things like conjugation of metabolites and things like that. It can get quite complicated if you're not fully aware of the issues involved. Obviously, increased use also encourages streamlining of analysis and improved robustness. As I said before, if something is too overly complicated or unreliable, nobody's going to volunteer to do samples for that analysis. We're not masochists most of the time. One of the most common things about development of analytical methods, and this applies across the board, regardless of what your sampling meter is the improvement in detection limits. Little lab rats like us love seeing less and less and less and less in a sample. And that doesn't necessarily help people who don't understand the intricacies of such a thing. So when you used to be getting non-detected for all your workers and you were sitting there happy that everything was under control, then we changed the method and now we give you numbers, and you're going, but they didn't used to have numbers, they used to be non-detected, so now they're positive, is that what you're saying? And we're just saying, no, we're just more clever. And you're going, well, thanks for that. So it's the duty on the laboratory rather than on you, of course, to actually explain what that means. And if you can't provide a number below which is negative for all purposes in terms of control and management, then you might as well have had to stick with the old method that just said non-detected, because you're not helping the people that actually need to use that result in a practical way. Increased use of biomonitoring drives new methods and new developments in actually how you would measure and what you would measure. And better control overall in the industrial environment means that exposure levels to the workers are fortunately coming down, and that's your good work. But that means that some biomarkers that were adequate in the past are no longer sufficient for the purpose. Benzene is a good example of this, and the biomarkers that have been proposed for monitoring have evolved as exposure limits and exposures have decreased. So back in the good old days, you could measure urinary phenol for benzene, and that would give you sufficient detail about what the exposures were like. As time went on and exposures came down, the levels of urinary phenol would not reflect benzene exposures at all. They just reflect other dietary exposures, other environmental exposures. And so we moved to transmethonic acid, for example, but there are other sources of that, for example, sorbate, which is found very widely in carbonated soft drinks, for example. And so as exposures came down again, that was also not so good for monitoring exposure. So these things do develop over time. Another example is arsenic. You used to measure total arsenic, and when occupational exposures were sufficiently high, that would be enough to say whether there was a problem or not. However, there's a lot of organic arsenic in seafood and fish and red wine and all good things, basically. But it's okay because it's not seen to be a particularly toxic form of arsenic. But if you're looking at workers using inorganic arsenic and they're eating seafood and drinking red wine, then you're not going to be able to see the actual risk of the inorganic carcinogenic arsenic that they're exposed to. And so over time, the method has moved to a total inorganic method using hydride generation, and now most laboratories that specialize in biological monitoring would offer speciated analysis for arsenic, where you can actually only measure the inorganic forms of arsenic that you're interested in. As a general business idea is that market demand will drive quicker, easier, and almost point-of-care testing for all sorts of analysis. To date, this has been very, very limited for biological monitoring, and simply because the market is not there. You know, I work in a niche discipline, I know. But there has been some demand in some areas. So, for example, offshore benzene. This is a concern for some of the oil and gas industry, and they are interested as to whether there could be tests that could be done on offshore rigs to screen people in or out as to their benzene exposure. It's still early days for that, I'm afraid. Lead, for example, most lead exposures require a blood sample, and that brings difficulties because you need a trained phlebotomist or a doctor to do that. And so there has been renewed interest in looking at ways of sampling blood lead. My old boss used to do blood lead when he first started back in the day, and they used to go around and slash people's ears. I don't think they had the same ethics then. I mean, and drip it onto a filter paper and then punch a hole in the filter paper and weigh it. Excellent. Anyway, but we are coming back round to slashing people's ears. No. So if you give blood, if you do blood donation, you will get a thumb prick test first to make sure that you have some hemoglobin. And people are looking at devices where you could do a similar sort of thing, and you then suck the blood up through a capillary, and if that was sufficient, you wouldn't need medical supervision to be actually take those samples, and it would make it more widely available. There are issues with that, of course. If you're in a dirty industry, stabbing somebody's thumb is probably not the best place to be taking a sample to avoid contamination, I would suggest. But it is being looked at least. Biological monitoring that works can also mean, do we know what to do with the answers? As I said, just being a number-generating game is not really useful to you. So we need to be able to tell you what that means and how you might use that. We've certainly seen in our laboratory that if there are official guidance values, that will drive sampling. So people in industry say, oh, there is a guidance value for this, so perhaps we'll measure it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that they only measure the things that guidance values were set for. And certainly in my country, the last time a guidance value was set for biological monitoring was over 10 years ago, so it's not necessarily reflecting what's going on in the world today. It is important that everybody's clear about the basis for the derivation of the guidance values that are out there, because they are not all set in the same way, and you do have a mixture of things that are health-based, so you can be fairly sure that if you're under that number, then you're not expecting any health impacts, to compare to non-health-based, which are either based on what is practicable or just a picture of what's actually going on in the real world, regardless of whether it's good or bad. And so your interpretation for those different derivations is very different. It's important that they're based on robust data sets. I've seen some in the past where people have suggested numbers for guidance values, and literally it's 25 numbers off of the back of a fag packet that haven't been published, they haven't been peer reviewed, but the person on the committee has some influence and they just say, oh, this is from my company, trust me, it's good data. I hope that we would get to a more transparent world than that in future. It is important to understand things like background levels. As you may know, population biomonitoring is very popular, particularly in places like the US, where they have the NHANES study and do vast amounts of monitoring. And from this, we know that everybody is exposed to lots and lots of chemicals, but don't panic. It's all right. So if your exposure levels in the workplace are coming down and people have exposures, you need to know where you need to be worried and where you don't need to be worried, because you're actually still within the general population range. There are also confounders that need to be taken into consideration, and that can be other chemical exposures that give the same metabolites, and it can be things like work rate and environment. Biological variability, it gets talked about, but actually in the grand scheme of things is a very minor component of confounding. The biggest confounder is that your external exposure in the work environment varies hugely all the time, as you as hygienists will know better than I how much that varies. I would encourage the publishing of data. Data is good for everybody. It doesn't have to be peer review publications in journals, although I would encourage people to do that. It's not as hard as you think. You just have to keep sending it around to some journal, give it and publish it for you. But also coming to a conference and talking to people about the data that you have. Social media is a great way of blogging about data sets that not necessarily going to set the world alight, but it's all data that's useful to the community, I think. And also health and safety magazines. I think these are an underrated source of communicating our messages, and I'm guilty of that as anybody. So please, if you have data, share it, I would suggest. Okay, so case studies. I think this is actually what they meant by showing that biological monitoring works. You want to know that it's actually effective, it's actually worth doing, and you will actually get some kind of positive benefit from doing it. So I'm going to talk about a number of case studies to hopefully demonstrate and persuade you that that is true. So MVR, we already talked about. This is a very large national intervention project held in the UK, and I'll talk about that. And then I'll talk about two more modest case studies, single company cases, looking at PPE and skin absorption. So, In the UK, in the mid-2000s, occupational asthma was a big concern for vehicle paint sprayers. They use isocyanate 2-pack paints, and they were at the time 80 times more likely to have occupational asthma than any other defined occupational group. And HSE weren't really sure why that was, because actually most of them did wear air-fed RPE, and actually most of them did spray in enclosed booths. So we did a lot of research at the Health and Safety Laboratory about how those exposures could be occurring, and there were basically misunderstandings in the industry and behavioural issues that were causing. So visor flipping was very common, so as soon as they stopped spraying, they flipped the visor to check the quality of the paint finish. And there was also a lack of understanding about clearance time of booths. So people just assumed that the booth had air coming in the top and it took out through the floor, and so as soon as you stop spraying, you're in fresh air. And of course that's just simply not true. The booth fills with thousands of micrograms of isocyanate in a very short space of time. And most booths will take at least 90 seconds to clear, and if you're using a homemade spray room, it'll take something like 15 minutes to clear. Now that's not necessarily a problem as long as you wear your air-fed to get in and out of the booth during the clearance time. So once we knew what the problems were, we decided that we should have an awareness intervention program to get out there to the industry. So we ran these half-day awareness events using a variety of media, so things like videos, so a video with an occupational asthma sufferer. This was quite powerful because people go, oh yeah, everybody's got asthma. Oh, so what? Yeah. But actually this guy had to give up work at the age of 36 or something. He can barely walk 200 yards without having to use his inhaler. And you can feel a chill. Sorry, I'll stop doing that. You can feel the chill in the room when you were giving these presentations, or seeing them watch how it affected some man who was in the prime of life at the time he had to give up work. We showed off our fancy research for things like showing, this is in normal lighting, you can't actually see that there is a isocyanate mist in the room at all, so they're just not aware of it. But if you use Tyndall lighting, you can see that actually the place is just full of isocyanate spray, and it's just making them aware of that. And then showing them clearance times by using models of cars in boxes. You spray cars every day, you don't want to see a car in a box, do you? Oh yeah, we love that, we love that. So they really like the models, but it shows you how the eddies form around the slits in the lighting holes here, and that's how it takes so long to clear, because you just get this recirculating going on. So this is a hard-to-reach sector. There are about 12,000 paint sprayers in the UK. Most of those work in micro or small businesses, and often they are the only painter, so they don't have any peer group to help them out. And so trying to get hold of those people, we're a government organisation, we're not very good at talking to small business, was a complete challenge. But we didn't do it alone. It was a program with trade associations, booth manufacturers, RPE manufacturers, the occupational health provision sector, and everybody came together to make this work. And so we got about 1,400 body shops to attend awareness events over a 4-year period. And in addition to that, we also did about 1,000 inspection visits from HSE inspectors. So it was a massive investment of time and effort, and of course money. And so we need to know whether it had any impact, of course. So there was an evaluation, an independent evaluation that followed up with 500 body shops. Only about 100 of those actually went to an event. So the rest of them were just in the industry but hadn't actually gone to the event. Those that had could remember what they had been told, the key points that they were supposed to remember. 91% of larger body shops knew the clearance time, and this is including 400 body shops that hadn't actually been to an event. And 85% now had a pressure gauge fitted, so they would know whether the booth was actually working under negative pressure or not. And 13% of those companies that were surveyed now undertake regular biological monitoring, as recommended by the inspectorate. That's up to 25% for the larger companies. No surprise that it's less for the single companies. But we get a lot of sampling from individuals who are just doing spray painting as a one-man band operation. So it does work because it's simple and easy to do. They can just literally buy a kit from us off the internet. We also send them everything they need to do. They wee in the bottle, they put it in the packaging, they put it in the post box, and they get a result. So if you make it easy enough, people can do it, even if they are literally a one-man business. So, does it work? Well, we're certainly making a lot of money out of it. So 2004 to 2008 was the awareness event, and you can see that HSE are paying for most of the samples done during this time. And during this, there was the requirement to do annual testing, which drove the sample numbers up enormously. And now most of those sample numbers are actually paid for by the industry themselves, so the government isn't paying for those tests. That's only one part of the story. You can get people to do monitoring. That doesn't mean that anything's getting any better, of course. So let's look at the number of asthma cases that we actually get reported through our reporting scheme. And just before we started the intervention, there were about 167 cases per 100,000 workers in the UK for paint sprayers. That came down after the intervention to about 70, and then a follow-up now shows about 55. So there has been a decrease in the number of occupational asthma cases. And I'm not saying it's all down to urine sampling, but you have to have a concerted effort through multiple channels, but it can work. This is another example. This is looking at tunnelling work. This is Belfast sewers renewal, and they were drilling a tunnel through some previously contaminated land from an old gasworks. They knew that the soil was potentially contaminated with benzene. They'd had some soil analysis done. It showed that there were potentials for quite high benzene levels, but it was quite intermittent and dispersed, so they weren't really sure how it would act in the reality of tunnelling. So they kitted the guys up, so they were wearing Tyvek overalls, they were wearing RPE, and they decided that they would put BM in place as well to see what exposures were like across a shift, because they were expecting these very short, sharp spikes when they came through pockets of contamination. So we started the monitoring. We're looking at SPMA as a biomarker, and all seems fine in the early spring. And then, bizarrely for the UK, it starts to get warm. The sun comes out, and so obviously working in tunnelling is a hot and dirty work in the first place, and so if the external temperature also rises, it doesn't help things. And then we saw a massive increase in exposures, and this was very concerning. Some people were 10 times the acceptable limit. So the company took the decision to actually halt tunnelling, and that's no mean undertaking. It was estimated that decision cost them something like 50,000 Australian dollars a day to do that. So it's not cheap to stop work. They provided upgraded PPE, so they moved to powered respirator hoods, heavy-duty gloves and chem suits rather than Tyveks. But they also changed a lot of behaviour things. So the problem was that people were taking water breaks in the tunnels because they were so hot. They were taking the hoods off to answer telephone calls. And they were working 12-hour shifts. And you saw the picture at the beginning. They had to climb out of the tunnel in a scaffold ladder if they wanted to take a break. So that's just not going to happen. So they moved to 8-hour shifts. They brought in water breaks. They brought in hands-free communication. And they also provided chilled ventilation to the tunnel, which obviously must have been quite expensive itself. And it worked. So the rest of the job continued through that contaminated site, and things were under control. So that's good. My last example is evaluating skin expulsion. This is some industrial flooring manufacture. You have a piece of chipboard, you spray MDI glue on it, and then you crimp some steel panels to that. Did some biological monitoring and air monitoring, and you can see that everybody is above the guidance value in the UK for MDI. This red line is the expected correlation you would get between air monitoring and biological monitoring if your exposure was breathing the stuff in. And as you can see, everybody's above that line, so there's an additional source of exposure than what they are breathing in. And so my contention would be that that would be gloves and skin. So these guys were using leather gloves, mostly to protect from the physical injury issues. They had to pick these panels up, which are about 50 centimetres square, and then move them around and put them for storage and such like, so they wore leather gloves to protect them from that. Obviously, leather gloves don't have a huge reputation for being chemical proof. So we moved to a polyester type glove with chemical protection, and you can see that in every single case, I mean, one person was negative to start with and negative afterwards, so that's good, but everybody else who was positive, all of them had reduced exposure after changing the glove type, and the air level, measured air level, was exactly the same as previously. So it's nothing to do with what's in the air, nothing to do with the way they did work. Simply changing a glove type can have a massive impact on people's exposures. What not to use BM for? I do love it, but you know, it's not good for everything. So things like acutely toxic gases, there are better ways to do it. Particle stuff, we are starting to work on this, but it's not there yet, but watch this space. And, you know, corrosives, irritants, non-hazardous chemicals, no, there are other things to do. Don't use it for filling a filing cabinet. Please take some action on the results that you get. And don't use it for worker discipline. My hygienists tell me that they find biological monitoring results are excellent for engaging workers and changing behaviour, more so than the expert opinion sometimes. Although I think he's just being modest there. Or perhaps he's rubbish at it, I don't know. So let's talk about a practical system for hygienists. What can you do to make biological monitoring work for you? Focus on the high-risk things. Set up a robust monitoring programme. You don't have to be there in charge of it, but you have to be involved in how it's going to be set up. Spend your time getting a good baseline so you know where you're starting from, and make sure you understand how you're going to respond to any results that you get. Don't wait for your high result to come and then go, ooh, now what do we do? Have that all in place first. Relate the sampling to the size of the problem. You know, don't be spending loads of time, effort, money, retelling yourself that this area over here doesn't have any problems. That's not helpful. If it does go wrong, if there are exposures that are over what you expect, then that's when you get called in to go and sort it out. So, this is my idea of what BM that works is. It's simple, it's affordable, and it's convenient, because otherwise people won't use it and they won't engage with it. You've got a specific and sensitive biomarker so that you know that what you're measuring is actually telling you something valid about the exposure. You've got some guidance, and I'm not saying guidance values, but some guidance to help you give interpretation of those results and act appropriately on them. It helps if the biomarker responds to interventions, so you've got short-term biomarkers when you're looking at interventions, because you want to see that you've made a difference. And you've got to have your feedback loop defined and adhered to. You've got to know what you want to do in the event of something going wrong. That's me. Thank you very much. And that's the delightful building that I work in the rolling hills of the Derbyshire countryside. And it doesn't look like that now. It's about 0 degrees or so. Thank you.